The scar on his knuckle had never healed straight. Darren Cole sat on a cold metal crate in the belly of the freighter, wrapping his right hand with a strip of cloth the way he had done every morning for 6 years. Not because it hurt anymore, just because the routine was something solid, something that belonged to him alone. The cargo hold of the narrow gap smelled like engine coolant and dry grain packs. Crates were stacked to the ceiling in neat rows, locked down with cable ties and magnetic clamps. Darren had loaded half of them himself. Heck knew the weight of each one. He knew the sound this ship made when it was content and when it was not. After 18 months aboard, the freighter felt more like a home than any place with walls and a roof ever had. He preferred it that way. You know, said a voice from the doorway. Most people eat breakfast in the morning, not stare at boxes. Silo came in, ducking his head under the low frame, a man wide enough in the shoulders that doorways were always a negotiation. He carried 2 cups off something hot and held one out without asking. Darren took it. The liquid inside was brown and bitter and nothing like real coffee. But out on the outer rim trade routes, real coffee was a memory you carried in your mouth. I did the checks, Darren said. I know. I watched the log. You did them at 4 in the morning. Silo settled onto a crate across from him, his big hands wrapped around his cup. Normal people sleep at 4 in the morning, my friend. Normal people don't haul medical cargo through debris corridors. Silo laughed. It was the kind of laugh that filled a room and asked nothing in return. Darren had liked that about him from the first week. Silo did not need anything from a conversation except the conversation itself. He never pushed, never pried, just showed up with bad coffee and stayed. We dock at Marin 7 in 3 hours, Silo said. Captain Bodo says we are picking up a new crew member. A medic. Darren said nothing. Veil, Silo added. Never worked with a veil before. I hear they glow. They have bioluminescence, Darren said. Emotional response. Their skin shifts color based on what they feel. They cannot turn it off. Silo raised his eyebrows. You read up on them? I read up on everyone. Silo gave him a long look, the kind that said something without needing words. Then he drank his coffee and let the silence be what it was. Marin 7 was a way station the size of a small town, bolted to the side of an asteroid and kept alive by the constant traffic of ships passing through the outer corridor. It was loud, crowded, and smelled like fuel and fried food and the particular stress of hundreds of different species all trying to be somewhere else. Darren stood near the docking clamp controls and watched the boarding ramp. He was not waiting for anything specific. He told himself that. She came up the ramp with a travel case in 2 of her forearms and a smaller medical bag in the other 2. The Veil were tall. She stood a full head above Silo, which was a thing Darren had not expected, with narrow shoulders and a feathered crest that ran from the top of her skull down the back of her neck. Her skin was a pale silver, and at the moment, as she came aboard and looked around at the ship, it was lit with threads of soft gold running just beneath the surface. Excitement. He knew that much. Captain Bodo met her at the top of the ramp. The old Greth captain was built like a boulder that had learned to walk, and his greeting style was to state a name, point at a person, and move on. He did this for each crew member in order. When he reached Darren, he said the name and moved the thick scale of 1 finger in Darren's direction. The Veil, Lyra, Bodo had said, turned to face him. She extended 2 of her 4 hands, palms up, fingers open and spread wide. It was a gesture that Darren had read about. In Veil culture it meant, I show you my hands. I have nothing in them. I am not a threat. That IT was their oldest greeting. A gesture of complete openness. Darren reached out and shook one of her hands with a firm, brief grip, the way he shook any hand. Her crest flattened. Not all the way. Not an offense. More like the slow flicker of something that had been expecting a door to open and found a wall instead. Her gold light dimmed a shade. She recovered quickly. She was professional and clearly practiced, and gave a small nod and moved on to Silo. Silo, for his part, shook all 2 of her extended hands at once with both of his, grinning like a man who had just made a lifelong friend in under 4 seconds. Her light came back up to gold immediately. Darren returned to the cargo hold. That night the ship was in open transit, stars spread thin and cold outside the porthole beside his bunk. Darren lay on his back with one arm behind his head and looked at the dark above him. There was a field somewhere in his memory. There was fire at the edge of it. There was a name he did not say out loud, because saying it out loud had stopped being something he could do a long time ago. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep for another 2 hours. In the medic's quarters, one corridor over, Lyra recorded her first log entry on the ship. She spoke in her own language, soft and quick, and the small device on her desk translated as she went. At the end, she paused for a long moment. Then she said, "The human male, Darren Cole, emits no emotional light that I have studied humans. I have read their biology and their history, but I have never stood in front of a living thing and felt nothing coming back. Not cold, not anger, not grief, nothing. Like standing in front of a wall that has learned to breathe." She stopped the recording. Outside, the stars continued past the hull in their long, indifferent silence. Lyra had examined 41 different species in her career. She had worked in refugee stations, on colony ships, in field clinics on 2 planets that were technically still in the middle of a war when she arrived. She had seen bodies that had been broken in ways that should not have been survivable and watched them survive anyway. She had held instruments in all 4 hands and made decisions in seconds that other doctors debated for hours. She had never once failed to read a patient. Until now. The evaluation room on the narrow gap was small, a converted storage unit with a fold-out bed and a cabinet of basics. Lyra had organized it in the first hour after boarding. Everything in its place. Labels facing out. The kind of order that made a small space feel like it called handle large problems. The crew came one by one, as she called them. Silo arrived first and spent the whole evaluation talking about his home city and asking her questions about the Vale home system with the enthusiasm of someone who had always wanted to visit. Her crest was bright the entire time. The others were easy too. A nervous young cargo handler named Finwo winced at the blood pressure cuff. A quiet navigator who barely spoke but made direct eye contact. Captain Bodo, who submitted to the physical with the dignity of a man who found the whole process slightly beneath him but tolerated it out of respect for procedure. Then Darren Cole knocked twice on the doorframe and stepped inside. "Sit anywhere," she said. He sat on the edge of the fold-out bed with his hands resting on his knees. Straight back, relaxed enough not to be rigid. His eyes moved around the room once, taking note of the exits and the contents, she suspected, and then settled on a point just past her left shoulder. "I'll start with basics," she said. "How was your sleep?" "Fine. How many hours on average?" "Enough." She made a note. "Any pain anywhere regular?" "No. Headaches. Sometimes." "How often?" A pause. "Twice a month. Maybe." She worked through the rest of the standard questions. He answered each one with the minimum number of words that still counted as an answer. Not rude. Not cold exactly. It was more precise than cold. Cold implied something was being withheld out of feeling. This was something else. This was a man who had decided long ago exactly how much of himself he would give to any situation, and had stuck tot-hat decision so long it had become the shape of him. When she moved to the physical portion and asked him to remove his outer shirt, he did so without comment. She kept her expression professional. The burn scar on his left shoulder was old, 10 years at least, judging by the way the skin had fully resettled. It spread from just below his shoulder blade to the top of his arm in a pattern that suggested heat from above. Not an accident. Something that had fallen or detonated nearby. There were other scars. Smaller ones. The kind of body collected over years of being somewhere dangerous. "The shoulder," she said, in the same tone she used for everything. "What happened?" "Explosion. 6 meters away. Left side took the edge of it." "How long ago?" 8 years. "Any stiffness in the joint now?" "Sometimes in cold. Nothing that stops work." She nodded and finished her notes. Her skin, she was aware, had gone a muted gray without her meaning it to. She pulled it back toward neutral. Professionalism meant keeping her light steady. She did not always manage it perfectly. In a mess hall that evening, she sat across from Silo and ate the dense, protein-heavy meal that the ship's dispenser called dinner. Silo was working through his second bowl and reading something on a small screen, and the easy quiet between them had already started to feel normal. After a while, she said, "Silo, can I ask you something about the crew?" He put the screen down. "Of course." "Darren Cole." She kept her voice even. "How long has he been like that?" Silo was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable, just choosing. "He was already like that when I met him," he said. "I have been on this ship 2 years. He was here before me." He turned his bowl a little. "I know bits. Not everything. He was a combat medic, military. Long service." A pause. "There's a planet called Rova 3. His whole unit." "All of them." Silo did not finish the sentence, that he did not need to. Lyra's skin went blue before she could stop it. A deep, involuntary blue. The color her kind made when grief arrived suddenly. Silo noticed. He did not comment on the color. He just said quietly, he does not talk about it. Not ever. So I pretend I do not know, and he pretends there is nothing to know. And that is how we are friends. She thought about that for a long time after dinner. It was the second night out when the cargo hold went dark. A coupling failure in the secondary power relay. Minor, but Inato cut the lights to the lower deck for 7 minutes before the backup engaged. Lyra was in the corridor when it happened and stood still, waiting, her skin pulsing a cautious pale yellow. She heard footsteps in the dark. Calm, even, not rushing. Then a small mechanical sound, a panel opening, a tool connecting, and then the lights came back on. Darren was standing at an access panel 6 meters down the corridor, a small manual driver in his hand. He closed the panel, tested the wall switch, nodded once at the result. He had not needed a light-o find the panel. He had not needed to look at the wall to find the switch. He turned and saw her watching. He said nothing. He gave one small nod, the same nod he gave for everything, the nod that meant acknowledged and nothing more, and walked past her toward the hold. Lyra stood where she was. Her crest had risen without her realizing it, and her skin was doing something she recognized but rarely felt when looking at another person. Amber. Slow, deep, steady amber. In her culture, amber meant, "I have seen something true." She lowered her crest deliberately and walked back to her quarters, but the amber stayed with her longer than it should have, warm and quiet under her skin, like an ember that had decided not to go out. The sound came without warning. A deep, structural bang from the lower cargo bay, followed by a sharp cry, followed by silence. The kind of silence that comes after something has gone badly wrong, and the ship itself seems to hold its breath waiting to see what happens next. Lyra was on her feet before the intercom opened. She already had her medical bag in 2 of her hands by the time Captain Bodo's voice came through flat and urgent. "Medic to cargo bay 2. Now, the scene when she arrived was this. A heavy container, about the size of a small vehicle, had broken its magnetic clamp during a minor course correction and shifted across the deck. It had not fallen on Anion, but in moving, its corner had struck Fun, the young cargo handler, the one who winced at blood pressure cuffs, and sent him into the wall hard enough to do serious damage. Fun was on the floor, conscious barely. His color was wrong. His breathing was shallow and too fast. When Lyra knelt beside him and pressed carefully along his left side, his face went white and hemade a sound that told her everything she needed to know about the state of what was underneath. Internal bleeding. Almost certainly. She looked up at Bodo. "I need the medical bay. Now. I need 2 people to carry him, and I need them to be careful." Her skin was cycling red and white without her control. Fear pulse. She knew it. She could not stop it. She pulled her focus down toward work and kept her hands steady even when the rest of her was not. The medical bay was too small for this. She had known when she first saw it that the room was built for basics, cuts, burns, fractures, the routine damage of ship work. That IT was not built for internal trauma surgery. She had the tools for stabilization and not much more. She was running through her options at speed and finding the gap between what she needed and what she had growing wider every second. She was setting up the 4 line and calculating whether she could manage the bleed with what she had when she heard the door. She did not look up. "I said no one in here, I know." Darren's voice. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway in his work clothes, one shoulder against the frame, looking at Fun on the table with the same expression he used for cargo checks. Calm. Assessing. I can help, he said. Tell me what. There was no warmth in it. No offer of comfort. No performance off willingness. Just a statement of fact, flat and direct, waiting for her to use it or not. She looked at him for 1/2 second. Then she said, wash your hands. Cabinet on the left. Gloves in the second drawer. And do not touch anything on the tray until I tell you. He moved. What happened in the next 2 hours was not easy to describe later, though Silo would ask and Lyra would try. It was not that Darren became a different person. He did not suddenly warm, did not speak more than necessary, did not fill the room with anything except competence. But the competence itself was a thing that changed the texture of the air. He knew what instruments were called without being told. He knew how to hold a light steady for long periods without his arm drifting. He knew when to hand something before she asked and when to stay completely still. Once, when she was working deep and her fourth hand began to shake slightly from the angle, he said quietly, brace against my arm. She did. The shaking stopped. He said nothing else for 40 minutes. When Fun's readings began to level and his color came back, tosamething approaching normal, Lyra sat back on the stool behind her and let her breath out in a long, slow release. Her skin, which had been cycling red-white for 2 hours, faded down through orange and then settled into a pale, exhausted green. Darren had already begun cleaning the instruments. She watched him work. He rinsed, dried, replaced. Systematic, quiet, as though this were just another cargo check, just another routine task in a long series of them. Where did you learn to work like that? She asked. Not the biology, not the technique. The how to be in a room when something is falling apart. He did not answer immediately. He kept his hands moving on the instrument he was drying. Then he said, I had a good teacher. A pause. He set the instrument down. She did not make it. He did not turn around when he said it. He said it the same way, said everything, level, clean, with no edges showing. But Lyra had been reading living things her whole life, and she heard something in those 5 words that his voice was working very hard not to carry. She did not plan what she did next. She reached out and touched his arm, just below the elbow. 2 offer hands, light as anything, resting there for 3 seconds. Her skin shifted without her permission. Deep blue, the color off grief recognized. The color that meant, I heard what was underneath its sentence. I'm not going to pretend I did not. Darren went completely still. Not a flinch, not a pull away, just stillness. The kind that happens when something reaches a place that has not been touched in a very long time and the body does not yet know what to do with the information. His jaw moved once. He breathed. Then he set down the last instrument, nodded toward Fun on the table, and said, his pressure should hold through the night. Wake me if it drops below 80. And he walked out. Lyra sat in the small medical bay for a long time after. Fun breathed steadily on the table. Her skin stayed blue. 2 days after the medical bay, Darren stopped sleeping. Not completely. He slept in short intervals. An hour here, 40 minutes there, and rose before anyone else and went to the cargo hold and worked without asking himself why. Silo noticed and said nothing. Captain Bodo noticed and said nothing. The ship moved through the outer corridor in its usual rhythm, and everyone let the quiet be quiet. But Lyra noticed something that the others did not. It was not that Darren was more withdrawn. He was exactly as withdrawn as he had always been. It was that the withdrawal itself had changed quality. Before, his silence had been a settled thing, old and dry and complete, the way a scar is complete. Now it had a tension in it. Like a wall that had developed a crack, it was working very hard to hold. She did not approach him. Not directly. She checked on Fun, who was healing cleanly and already complaining about bed rest, which she took as a good sign. She did her work. She ate her meals. She waited. On the second night, she found him in the cargo hold. She had not gone looking. She had been walking to get water from the lower galley, and the hold door was slightly open and the lights inside were off. She almost walked past. Then she stopped, looked through the gap and saw him. He was sitting on the floor, back against a crate, knees up, arms resting on his knees, looking at the stars through the small portfolio in the far wall, which showed a narrow strip of black and light. He did not startle when she pushed the door open further. He had heard her footsteps in the corridor. She suspected. He heard everything. She walked in, sat down on the floor beside him, a half-meter away, with her back against the same crate. She did not ask permission. She did not announce herself. She just settled. He did not tell her to leave. They sat in silence for a long time. The ship hummed. The stars moved slowly past the porthole. Somewhere above them, the heating system cycled and the metal walls ticked. It was Lyra who spoke first. "On my world," she said, keeping her voice low, "we have a word, veil theory." She shaped the syllables carefully. It is hard to translate exactly. The closest is the grief that has never been witnessed. She paused. "We believe it is the most dangerous kind, not because it is the largest grief, but because it lives in the dark and nothing can reach it there." The silence continued. "I think," she said, carefully, "that you have been carrying yours alone for a very long time." Nothing from him, but he had not moved. He was still looking at stars, and his hands on his knees were very still, and she knew by now that his stillness was not the same as emptiness. His stillness was how he listened. More silence passed. A minute, maybe two. Then Darren said, "Rova 3, just the name. Nothing else yet." But it was a door opening. She waited. It was supposed to be a short deployment. 14 weeks. Help stabilize a colony that was caught between two factions. His voice was level. He had the voice of a man who had learned to speak about difficult things from behind a wall of control. "My unit was 12 people. Combat medics attached to a peacekeeping force." He paused. "We were there for 9 weeks when it went wrong." She did not prompt him. She did not fill his pauses. "There was a field," he said, "outside a settlement called Dura. We were setting up a forward medical post. The ground attack came at dawn. No warning the sensors caught. Just dawn, and then everything on fire." Another pause, longer. "I was in the supply shelter when it started. The shelter held. Nothing else did. The hum of the ship. The stars outside. There was a medic named Petra," he said. "She taught me almost everything I know. 14 years in the field before Rova 3. She used to say that the best thing a medic could do was make the work so familiar it ran without thinking. Because thinking took time, and time was the one thing you never had enough of." His hands shifted slightly on his knees. "I found her in the field after she was still alive. For a while." He stopped. The silence this time was different. It had weight to it. The weight off a sentence that had never been said aloud before and did not quite know what to do with the open air. Lyra reached over. She placed 2 of her hands over his. Not gripping, not holding, just resting there. Warm and present and completely deliberate. The way you place a hand on something to tell it, "I am here, I am not going anywhere. Whatever this is, you do not have to hold it alone right now." And Darren's breath broke. Not loudly, not in tears. Just one single exhale that came apart in the middle, that lost its shape for one brief second before he pulled it back. One fraction of a moment where the control had held in place for 6 years slipped exactly 1 inch. It was the smallest thing. It was enormous. He did not pull his hands away. He sat very still with her hands over his and looked at the stars and breathed slowly and carefully the way a person breathes when they are relearning how. Lyra's skin moved through colors without her permission. Blue, for the grief she was holding with him. Amber, for the truth of who was underneath the stone. And then, slowly, settling deep and steady, a color she rarely showed. Violet, slow and constant and certain. The color her kind used for one thing only. "I will stay." He did not see it. He was still looking at the stars. But the light off it fell across his hands and across the floor between them. And it stayed there, quiet and unmoving, for the rest of the night. Nobody talked about what had happened in the cargo hold. Not because it was hidden, not because it was secret, but because some things do not need to be announced. They simply become part of the shape of a place. And everyone who lives in that place adjusts without a meeting or an explanation. The next morning, the ship was the same ship. The corridors were the same width. The breakfast dispenser made the same sounds, but something had shifted underneath it all, The way the air shifts on a ship when a slow leak has been sealed and the pressure settles back to what it was supposed to be all along. Darren was in the galley when Lyra came in. He had 2 cups set on the counter. He pushed one toward her without looking up from whatever he was reading on his small screen. She took it, sat across from him, drank it in the same silence he was drinking in. Nothing was said, but the silence was a different silence than it had been before. Silo noticed at breakfast. He noticed the cup on the counter before Lyra arrived. He noticed the exact distance Darren had set it from his own. Not beside it, the way you put a cup for yourself, but across from it, the way you set a place for someone you are expecting. He noticed these things and said absolutely nothing, which for Silo required considerable effort. He caught Captain Bodo's eye from across the mess table. Bodo gave one slow blink. In Greth body language, that was the equivalent of a satisfied nod. Silo smiled, so wide he had to look down at his food to hide it. The hail came at the 14th hour of the day cycle. A patrol vessel, designation not given, flying the gray and yellow markings of the Veresi Compact. They were a minor faction, not military, not exactly civilian, operating the space between both in ways that profited mostly themselves. They had been working this corridor for months. Everyone on the trade routes knew it. Boarding cargo ships on invented pretexts and confiscating whatever they decided was in violation of whatever regulation they invented that morning. The narrow-gapped cargo was medical supplies. Funn's injury had shown Lyra exactly how much those supplies mattered when things went wrong out here. She stood in the corridor outside the bridge and listened to the exchange on the ship intercom with her arms crossed and her crest flat. Bodo handled the first contact. He was polite. He was unmoved. He invited the patrol officer to specify the exact regulation being cited, and the patrol officer began to explain in the careful, circling language of someone who does not actually have a regulation but needs to sound like they might. Then Bodo said, "I will send my cargo handler to the airlock. He will supervise any inspection." He looked at Darren. Darren went to the airlock. The patrol vessel sent 2 officers aboard. They were a species Lyra did not immediately recognize, small-framed, quick-eyed, with the particular alertness of people who were used to being in charge of situations and measuring them fast. They stepped through the airlock and found Darren standing there. He was not doing anything threatening. He was not posturing or blocking or reaching for anything. He was simply standing, hands loose at his sides, expression neutral, taking up the full width off his shoulders, which were considerable in the narrow airlock corridor, looking at them with a flat, calm, completely unreadable expression of a man who had stood in worse places than this and found them manageable. The officers looked up at him. Darren said, "Cargo manifest is here. I can walk you through the hold when you're ready." The lead officer looked at the manifest display Darren had extended, then looked back at Darren, then at the manifest again. "This appears to be in order," he said. "I know," Darren said. The inspection took less than 4 minutes. The patrol vessel undocked and was gone within 10. Lyra fell into step beside Darren as he walked back from Thierlock. She had been watching from the corridor junction. "That was remarkable," she said. "I just stood there," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is what was remarkable." He looked at her sideways. Not quite a look of surprise, but the corner of something that might eventually become one. That night, she found him in the cargo hold again. Not by accident this time. She brought water for both of them and sat in the same spot as before. After a while, she said, "I have never told anyone on this ship something." A pause. "My first year practicing. There was a child out of Vale Girl, 6 years old. She came in with her family from one of the outer settlements. An infection we should have been able to treat." She stopped. Her light went a color he was starting to recognize. Blue, but darker, the kind that came from deep. "We did not catch it in time." "I did not catch it." He said nothing. He listened the way she had listened to him, completely, without moving, without offering anything except his full presence in the room. When she finished, the silence held them both for a moment. Then Darren said, "She was lucky to have you with her. Not. It was not your fault. Not. You did everything you could, just that." Lyra's light pulsed violet once, quick and bright, before she caught it. She looked away toward the porthole. Darren looked away toward the far wall. The stars continued in their long, patient silence outside. But the violet had happened, and they both knew it, and neither of them said a word about it, which was, in its own way, exactly right. Silo heard it first. He was 3 crates deep in the forward cargo bay, running a post-transit check on the tie-downs, when the sound reached him through the metal walls. Low, tuneless, barely there. Darren, in the adjacent section, was humming. Silo set down his scanner. He stood very still for a moment, making sure he was hearing what he was hearing. Then he sat down on the nearest crate, pressed both hands flat on his knees, and stared at the wall with the expression of a man receiving news she had been waiting a long time for. He did not say anything. He did not call out or make a joke. He just sat there for a moment and felt whatever it was he felt. Then he picked up his scanner, went back to his checks, and hummed along under his breath so softly that no one would have heard unless they were listening for it. The delivery station was called Vance Outpost, and it existed primarily as a point on a map where trade routes crossed at IT had a docking ring, a fuel depot, a small administrative block, and the particular tired energy of a place that had been built for function and never quite got around to anything else. They had been docked for 2 hours when the receiving agent called the captain's intercom and delivered the news in the flat voice of someone who had made this kind of call before and felt only slightly bad about it. The medical cargo was flagged. Bureaucratic hold. A licensing discrepancy in the supply manifest filed by the original distributor. Not the narrow gaps error, not Bodo's error, not anyone on board's error. A mistake made by a desk somewhere it would take time to verify. Standard processing was estimated at 2 to 4 weeks. In the station's back cargo bay, a refugee camp 30 minutes away by shuttle was down to a 2-week supply of critical medication. Lyra stood very still when she heard this. Her crest rose. Her skin went the pale yellow of controlled anger, something she rarely showed, something that looked entirely different from fear's yellow, but that anyone who knew her could tell apart. She went to the administrative block. She presented her medical credentials, her field experience, her documentation of injury and treatment aboard the ship as proof of the necessity off the cargo. She was professional and clear, and she did not raise her voice. She was told the process was the process and would take the time that it took. She came back to the ship and found Darren waiting at the bottom off the docking ramp. He had heard. Ships were small spaces and Bodo had not been quiet about his displeasure on the bridge intercom. "I know someone on this station," Darren said. She looked at him. "Old posting. We serve in the same sector for a while. He works logistics oversight now." He was already walking toward the administrative block. 3 minutes. Maybe less. She walked beside him. He found a comm terminal in the block side corridor and made the call standing up. The man who answered on the screen was older, broad-faced, with the look of someone who had spent many years in the field and settled into a desk without quite forgetting what the field felt like. His expression when he saw Darren went from professional to something warmer in about 1 second. Darren said, "I need a flag cleared. Medical cargo. Manifest. Number coming to your screen now. Refugee camp is running short." A pause. "I know it is not your section. I know it is a favor." The man on the screen looked at the manifest number. Looked back at Darren. "How bad is the camp situation?" 2 weeks, Darren said. A silence. Then, "Give me 20 minutes. It took 18. The flag was cleared before the end of the hour. The cargo was unloaded by evening. Neither Darren nor Lyra would ever learn the names of the people in the camp it reached. They would never hear if it arrived in time, or how many it helped, or whether the children there were doing well or badly, or somewhere in between. It would vanish into the world the way most good acts do, without a receipt. Darren stood outside the station docking ring afterward, where the outer observation corridor had a long strip of window facing open space. Lyra came and stood beside him. They looked at the stars. After a while, she said, "What will you do after this run?" "There is another run after this one. And after that one." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that used to mean a conversation was over. This time it did not feel that way. "I do not know yet," he said. "That is new for me." She looked at him. He was still watching the stars, but there was something different in the line of his shoulders. Not looser exactly. More like a man who has been carrying a weight for so long, he forgot what his own posture felt like without it, and is only now beginning to find out. New is not always bad, she said. No, he agreed. I'm starting to think that. Back aboard the narrow gap, route set for the next job, cargo bay sealed, and departure logged. Darren went to the holdout alphabet. Lights on. He did the evening checks the way he always did. Methodical, thorough, hands moving over clamps and cables with the knowledge of a man who knew this ship better than he had ever known any place on land. After a while, the door opened. Lyra came in with a small screen and a stylus, sat down on a crate in the corner, and began writing her medical notes. She did not explain herself. She did not ask if it was all right. She simply settled, the way she had settled beside him on the floor of this same hold, and made the space her own alongside his. He did not tell her to leave. He finished his checks. He moved to the next row. She wrote her notes. The ship hummed around them both. He looked at her once across the hold. She did not look up, but her skin pulsed, brief and warm and certain, in that deep, steady violet, the color that meant only one thing. He turned back to his work. And there, in the dark of the cargo hold with the stars pulling past outside, Darren Cole allowed himself one small and private thing he had not allowed in 6 years. Not hope exactly, not peace exactly, something quieter than both and more durable. He breathed, deep and even and unhurried, as if the air in this particular room, in this particular ship, with this particular light falling soft and violet across the floor, was air that actually belonged to him. The armor was not gone. It had been built over too many years and through too much fire to simply disappear. But it had a door now, a real one, with a hinge that worked, and someone he trusted held the key.